With American politicians focused on the presidential election and Europe's focused on trying to save the euro, Syria has fallen rather off the agenda. In this week's Economist, we have a leader arguing for military intervention in that country to try and prevent further killing in the civil war. I'm John Prideaux, the homepage editor at economist.com, and with me to talk about that leader is Ed Carr, the foreign editor who wrote it. Ed, just how bad is it in Syria?
Well, I think if you look at it by any normal standards, the rate of killing and the amount of death is extraordinary. We're up now probably above 30,000 casualties. A huge number of refugees are spilling over Syria's borders into the neighbouring countries and even further afield. People are dying at a rate of, I don't know, 250 a day. And just to give you a sense of how bad that is, it's around the sort of level that you saw in Iraq at the height of the insurgency. So although, as you say, this hasn't really been at the top of anyone's list politically, in terms of the amount of violence, and I would argue in terms of what it's doing to the region, this is a really, really serious problem.
We've called before for the creation of sort of safe havens in Syria, which probably would have required some kind of military intervention from outside. But this week, there's a slightly stronger call going a little bit further. Is it the continued high level of violence that has sort of changed your thinking in this week's current issue, or is it something else?
In intervening in Syria, there are three aims. The first and overriding one is humanitarian. The aim is to try and save lives, because the rate of killing, not just of rebels, but of innocent civilians, is extraordinary. The second is to try and stop the rebellion becoming more and more radicalized. The thing about Syria as a country was that it worked reasonably well. However much you disliked the Assad regime, it was a bunch of people from different sects and different ethnicities sometimes who got on with each other and who managed to make this work as a country. Well, as the rebellion goes on, the killing continues, this becomes more and more sectarian and more radicalized. So the hope of being able to put a country together afterwards diminishes. So the second aim is to try and have something that's worth saving. And then the third aim is to deal with the whole region. The fact is, Syria is jammed in an incredibly fragile and important part of the world. Its neighbours are all unstable countries. And a violent Syria with refugees pouring across the borders, fighting a proxy war where the government is supported by the Iranians and the Russians and the rebels, backed at the moment by the Turks and some of the Gulf states. That's a very, very worrying situation which the whole Middle East is involved in. And this war, I'm afraid, without intervention, could go on for a very, very long time indeed. Years, in fact.
And what kind of intervention are we talking about? We're not proposing a sort of Iraq or Afghanistan style, sort of lots of American boots on the ground.
Look, we've learnt that intervention is an extraordinarily hard thing to do. It's very, very hard if you invade a country to be able to persuade the people that you've gone in to help that you really are there for their benefit. It goes sour, it goes wrong, we've seen that. So we're not proposing anything like that. No boots on the ground, that's clear. Instead, I think what we're proposing is a no-fly zone. And the idea there is, first of all, to try and stop Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, using his air force in order to pummel cities. But the pattern of behaviour we've seen at the moment is that if the rebels gain hold of a city, then very quickly aircraft and helicopters and helicopter gunships are sent in, and they indiscriminately send in bombs. And the level of violence is growing all the time. Just recently, they've started using cluster bombs, which are particularly destructive to civilians. So the first aim of the no-fly zone is to stop the regime using air power. The other thing you can do is to create some sort of safe havens which allow the rebels to organize and train and to try and create something more of a unified command. I mean, one of the really bad problems of Syria is that it's utterly chaotic. There is no unified opposition. There is no unified rebellion. It's a bunch of militias, sometimes only of a few dozen people, doing what they can. And that makes it very hard to help, different from in Libya, for instance, where there were militias, but there was much more of an organised structure, and that made intervention easier. So creating safe havens doesn't definitely, but it could go some way towards helping the rebels organise.
And the politics of this at the United Nations are obviously horrible. You know, Russia has a long-standing relationship with Syria and doesn't want any intervention. China and Russia tend to stick together at the Security Council. Is there some way that some kind of diplomacy at the United Nations might be able to finesse that huge disagreement?
It's unlikely at the moment that Russia in particular will, having stuck its colours so firmly to the mast of the Assad regime, that it will suddenly roll over and change. I don't think you can rule out it entirely. I think there is, at some level, there are scenarios in which Russia and the rest of the world would be reasonably happy. For instance, if you were to get some sort of palace coup in which the Assad family were kicked out of power, but sort of elements, important elements of the regime remained, and so Russia would feel that it still had its connections, and Syria has been a very important customer and important client in the Middle East. I also think that going against the Security Council is something that has a real cost. I mean, the West argues in its dealings with the world that it's important that international norms are observed, and I believe it is, but it can't be paramount in my view. You know, you can't make tens of thousands of Syrians die because of the Security Council's not working. You can't put that bill on the Syrian people at some point. If you believe that the interests, humanitarian interests and strategic interests of the world are that there has to be intervention, then I think you have to put that first.
So the Security Council is blocked. Given that, how would you go about building some kind of support for the intervention you advocate?
I think it would be okay if there was intervention without UN support, so long as there was Arab support. And here, I think the ground has been shifting. People don't explicitly say they want intervention particularly by the US and NATO, but you can see the Gulf countries already are funneling weapons and money, and it's even possible, I think, that the Egyptians could, with persuasion and argument, be made at least tacitly to give their backing to this. So I think it's absolutely key that if you haven't got UN support, then you at least have the maximum Arab support possible. But there should be no mistake, this is a difficult operation. There's very few guarantees about the country that's left afterwards, but I just think that if you look at the likelihood of a very long, drawn-out, bitter dispute that sucks in the entire region and radicalizes Syria, I think the alternative is better.
Ed Carr, thanks very much.